In late October, the northern suburbs of Washington state began their slow surrender to the cold season. The maple leaves turned crimson, the wind whispered through the cracks in the rotting wooden fence, and the ashen sky mirrored the weight in Ethan's chest. 19 years old and freshly returned from college, he had come home not for a break, but for a burial. His father's. David's death came suddenly, a stroke in the backyard. No warning, no time to say goodbye. Just a trembling phone call at 2 a.m. from Marianne. "Your father didn't make it," she had whispered, choking on the words. The bus ride home was the longest journey of Ethan's life. Not for the distance, but for the memories that attacked without warning. He didn't cry, not because it didn't hurt, but because the hollow ache in his chest left no room for tears. When the bus finally stopped in front of the narrow road leading to the house, Ethan stood still in the icy wind. The sky above him was slate gray, as though the world itself wore mourning black. The funeral was held on a drizzling morning. The small church on the town's edge was blanketed in a silence so deep it felt like even the air held its breath. Ethan sat in the third row, his black coat damp with rain, the eulogy clutched in his hand. But his eyes stayed locked on Marianne in the front row. She sat motionless, dressed in a long black gown, her hair pulled back, her face bare. Her sunken eyes stared straight ahead, wide and vacant. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She was a statue in collapse. The only sign of movement was in her hands, clenched tightly around a worn, white handkerchief. David's. Ethan had never seen her like this. Marianne had always been gentle, warm. She would laugh lightly when she saw him, sneak cakes into his backpack before he left for college. She had never interfered between him and his father, always standing quietly in the background. But today, she was someone else entirely, an image of quiet devastation. And what disturbed Ethan most wasn't her silence, but the lost, aching way she looked at him, desperate but too hollow to cry. After the funeral, she stood in the rain as if unaware the service had ended. She didn't move. The house felt lifeless when they returned, as though it had lost not just a person, but its very breath. Ethan walked in, left his soaked shoes by the door, and didn't bother with the lights. The dim glow from the living room window was enough to reveal that everything was still in its place. The pale gray sofa, the wedding photo of David and Marianne on the wall, the round rug Marianne had once proudly chosen online because it looked like poplar bark. She sat in the armchair, still in her funeral coat, holding a cup of cold tea. Her eyes were fixed not on anything, but on the empty space between two walls. Ethan hesitated. "Are you hungry?" she asked, her voice distant, like it had just returned from a dream. "No," he said softly. "Are you?" She didn't answer. In the kitchen, everything was unchanged. The fridge held a half-empty jar of jam, a milk carton 3 days expired. His father's coffee cup still sat on the table, the stain at the bottom a small shadow of routine. When Ethan returned, Marianne had fallen asleep on the sofa, her head tilted, brow furrowed as if trapped in a painful dream. He sat across from her, watching the rain blur the world beyond the window. The house would stay cold, he knew, unless someone made an effort to warm it. The next morning, he awoke to the faint sound of water running. Marianne was at the sink, washing dishes slowly with her bare hands, 2 plates and a cup. Each movement was careful, almost reverent, like the dishes might shatter from a sigh. He leaned in the doorway, saying nothing. Her back looked thinner than before, her black hair tied back, exposing the pale nape of her neck. Loose strands trembled in the soft light. I don't know what to do, Ethan, she said suddenly, her voice barely audible. This whole house, every corner is him. He nodded. I know. That afternoon, Ethan sat in his old room, scrolling through his school's online portal. The library tab was open, but he wasn't reading. His eyes kept drifting to the exam schedule, then to an unread email from his academic advisor. He clicked on the deferred study section. When he reached the field for reason for deferment, he typed slowly, family reasons. Need time to take care of relatives. A soft ding confirmed the submission. It felt more real than anything had in days. That night, over a plain dinner of white rice and canned chicken soup, Ethan looked at Marianne and said, I'll stay, at least through winter. She looked up, stunned. You don't have to, she said. I know, I want to. She said nothing, but her chopsticks paused mid-air. Then, slowly, she nodded, as if receiving something she hadn't dared hope for. Later that evening, Ethan sat alone on the porch with a cup of hot tea. The wind was cold, but not cruel. Winter stretched ahead like an unanswered question, but he knew this much. If he didn't stay, the house would be swallowed by silence. Ethan's first days. The days passed like unnamed dreams. The house was quiet, so quiet you could hear the ticking clock in every room. Words were rare, disturbances rarer. Ethan woke early, made himself coffee, and sometimes made a second cup for Marianne, unsure if she'd drink it. He left it on the kitchen table anyway. Then he'd sweep the floor, wipe the windows, check the aging heating system when temperatures dipped below 5 degrees Celsius. Physical work dulled the ache. In this house, distraction was a form of survival. Marianne spent most of her time in David's study. His papers still lay across the desk, drawings unfinished, the old swivel chair untouched. She didn't clean or rearrange, just sat there, sometimes switching on the lamp, never reading. It was as if she needed the light, not the words. One afternoon, Ethan walked into the kitchen to find her peeling an apple. The knife moved with slow precision, creating long, curling ribbons of red-orange skin. He watched for a while. Then she said, Do you remember? Your father used to say no one could peel an apple like this. Ethan nodded. I remember. It was the first time she had spoken of David without breaking. They began eating together in the evenings, sometimes in silence, sometimes talking about the weather or the price of groceries. Slowly, something began to shift in Marianne. Her gaze grew steadier. She no longer fell asleep on the sofa. She began closing her bedroom door at night. On the 10th morning, Ethan woke to find the coffee cup he had left the day before empty. Then, on another gray afternoon, Marianne entered the living room holding a small wooden box. She said nothing, just placed it on the table and sat across from Ethan, who was reading. The box had an old iron hook. No lock. These were my father's, she said, staring at her hands. They're also pieces of us, our time as a family. Ethan put the book down. Inside the box were simple things: a wristwatch, a pen engraved with David's name, a few Polaroid photos, a stack of faded letters. One photo showed the three of them. David in the middle, his arms wrapped around them, his eyes bright with joy. Ethan remembered that day, a short camping trip in the mountains. The sky had been impossibly blue. Marianne pulled out another photo. The invisible distances. David bent over fixing a wooden chair on the porch. His face scrunched up in the sun. He always thought he could fix everything. She laughed, then paused, except for the invisible distances. Ethan knew she was referring to his relationship with David. Never strained, but never close. They lived on parallel tracks, intersecting only once. when they broke up. "I don't think he knew how to be a father," Ethan said softly. "But I never doubted that he loved me in his own way." Marianne nodded, her eyes moist. He tried. But sometimes adults carried too many wounds to hug someone completely. They sat in silence for a long time. After that, outside the rain had stopped, but inside each of them, something had just broken and was stitched together with the fragments of memory. Time passed in silence, as if the house and the two people in it had established their own rhythm far from the outside world. And in that silence, intimate moments began to arise, not loudly, not intentionally, but enough to make people's hearts tremble gently. Like the surface of an autumn lake, one evening, Marianne had a slight fever. Ethan knocked on the door, but there was no answer. He pushed the door open and entered, finding her lying on her side, her forehead red. The thin blanket had slipped off her body, her hand clutching the edge of the pillow. Ethan took a warm towel, gently wiped her forehead, then made a cup of honey and ginger water. She opened her eyes, looking at him drily, so much like him. "She muttered me?" Ethan asked, not sure he heard correctly. Marianne shook her head, closing her eyes. "I'm fine, thank you." The next day, when Marianne was well again, Ethan did not mention it again, but the way she looked at him was different from then on, something quieter. Quieter, as if searching for something in him that was lost. She started making coffee every morning, leaving a cup for Ethan in the evening. She asked him what he liked to eat and seasoned it carefully. Sometimes they watched movies together, old movies that David used to like. Marianne sat at one end of the sofa, Ethan at the other. But at a touching scene, she turned and said, "Your father cried at this part, remember?" And Ethan nodded, smiling. The distance between them then seemed to be connected by a fragile strain, vibrating with a name that was no longer there. Another time when Ethan was taking things out to the yard to burn wood. Marianne called out from the window, "Wait!" Then she ran out quickly, put on a sweater and thrust a pair of old leather gloves into his hands. "Your father's? Don't let your hands get cold like his." Ethan took it, saying nothing. But as he turned away, he felt his heart constrict, not because of the words, but because of the tone, gentle, familiar, almost caring, to the point where he didn't dare to analyze it that night. Ethan couldn't sleep. He, that night, lay there staring at the ceiling, thinking about Marianne's eyes that had been dull with grief but now began to light up whenever she looked at him, but the light wasn't like a stepmother's, and that scared him. Nothing happened, but he knew something was building slowly, gently but dangerously close to being noticed. Winter came quickly, covering the windows in the house with a layer of frost in the mornings. Ethan went out to gather firewood. His breath turning white in the cold air, he began to cook breakfast for them, turn on the fireplace early, and sometimes scheduled the mail for Marianne because she didn't want to leave the house. Marianne rarely left her bedroom except for dinner, and on sunny afternoons when she sat on the porch, wrapped in David's old wool scarf, drinking ginger tea. But there was one thing Ethan began to notice. Her eyes. It was no longer the blank stare of someone who had just lost someone. Nor was it the look of a stepmother looking at her stepson. It was a different look, as if she saw something new in him. Not simply missing David, not entirely grateful, but the presence of another person that made her heart begin to move. One afternoon, Ethan returned from shopping. As he entered the door, he saw Marianne standing in the hallway facing the window where the sunlight streamed straight down the long hallway. A warm yellow, she was wearing an old beige sweater, her hair loose when she turned to look at him. She wasn't smiling, but there was something in her eyes that made him stop for a beat. "Did you get Earl Grey tea?" she asked, her voice casual. Ethan nodded, handing over the bag. She took it. But her hand lingered on his for a longer time than usual. Not on purpose, but not by accident either. The next time, that gaze became constant when they cooked together. When Marianne poured tea, when she recounted old stories and occasionally pausing in the middle. Her eyes looked at Ethan as if trying to figure out if he was still himself, or if some memory of David was resurrecting. Ethan began to feel short of breath in his own house one day as he was cleaning the windows. Marianne came up standing very close behind him. "You're all grown up," she said. Looking straight into his reflection, he nodded. "Yes, you used to say I was always mature beyond my years." She smiled, but didn't look away. "It's really different now." Not a kid anymore that night. Ethan sat in his room, the lights off, holding a cup of cold tea. The words from the day kept coming back to him. Echoes in the closed space. He didn't know what to do. Nothing was clearly wrong. But things were approaching a gray area where he wasn't sure if he could still maintain the boundaries or if he was just pretending not to notice when they had blurred. Ethan began to avoid Marianne's eyes, not out of hatred, but out of fear. There were looks that carried something so familiar, so gentle that he felt like he was no longer the illegitimate child living in the old house, but someone else playing a role he had not asked for. He woke up earlier, went for longer runs, and tried to come home later in the afternoon. He made excuses to read in his room, refusing Marianne's invitations to watch movies together. He even stopped touching her when she handed him things, or lingering too long. When she smiled, because now that smile was no longer as innocent as before. One night, Ethan woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of his bedroom window creaking in the wind. He turned on the light and then glanced out into the hallway. Through the crack in the darkness between the two rooms. He saw Marianne's figure standing there. Silent for some unknown period of time. He didn't say anything. And she didn't come in. A few seconds passed in complete silence. And then her shadow turned away, as light as a whisper. Ethan sat up for the next hour, unable to fall back asleep. He wrote in his notebook, "Not all warmth is love, and not all distances shortened come from understanding. There are things called loneliness that seek loneliness, and if we are not careful, we mistake it for love." That afternoon, the sky was overcast, as if foreshadowing the first snowfall of the season. Ethan was cutting firewood in the backyard when he heard Marianne calling from the porch. "Ethan," she said, her voice as light as the early winter wind. "I want to ask you something." He wiped his hands on a towel and moved closer. "I'm listening." Marianne held a stack of printed papers in her hands. "Reservations routes, even a map of the small lake west of town. I'm going to the cabin on Lake Constance. Your dad took me there a few years ago. I don't want to go alone." Ethan looked at the papers, then at her. "How long? 3 days, 2 nights, she said, just for a change of pace." "I thought it might make us both feel better." He hesitated. The image of the small cabin by the lake flashed in his mind. A place of laughter, warm yellow lights, and the smell of new wood. But now, it was just a memory frame that Ethan wasn't sure he wanted to revisit. "I'm not sure we should go together," he said, his voice low. Marianne bowed her head. "I understand, but it's not because you need me to do anything. I just don't want to see myself reflected in the mirror again." Ethan was silent. There was something in her words, a weak, honest admission that made it impossible for him to refuse. Outright, "I'll think about it," he said, and turned toward the back of the house. His back was soaked with sweat despite the chilly. The trip wind that night. Ethan opened the closet and took out his father's old scarf, smelling the lingering scent of wood smoke. He looked out the window, where snow was beginning to fall lightly, and he knew if he agreed, this trip would be more than just a change of pace. Ethan agreed after 3 days of silence. There was no long conversation, no promises or clear reasons. He simply set his backpack down on the seat by the door and said, "I'm ready." Marianne nodded, and there was no triumph in that look, just an unexplained gratitude. They set off early in the morning. It was foggy. The ground was covered with a thin layer of snow, enough to make everything seem covered in a layer of silence. The car drove slowly along the winding mountain road with thick pine forests on the left and a cold, dormant glacier on the right. Ethan sat in the driver's seat, Marianne beside him wrapped in a thick coat and scarf. She turned on some music, old acoustic songs from the 90s that David used to like. The acoustic guitar played softly, as if echoing a time long gone. Neither of them said much, but the atmosphere was no longer as tense as it had been in the previous weeks. It was just empty at noon, and they stopped at a small roadside diner's one with a tilted wooden sign that read, "Hot soup in good silence." Marianne chose a table by the window, overlooking the snow-covered fields in the distance. "My dad used to sit right here," she said, twirling her spoon in her coffee cup. He ordered onion soup and complained that it was too sweet, but he ate it all. Ethan chuckled like my gingerbread. She looked at him. Yeah, but he never complained about it. They finally arrived at the lakeside cabin in the late afternoon, nestled among tall pine trees. The house looked like a frozen slice of memory. The wooden door still creaked as it opened, and the old, though faded scent of cinnamon candles lingered inside. Marianne turned on the heater and opened the curtains, and the late afternoon light cast long streaks of orange against the wooden walls, bringing with it a sense of a brighter time. Ethan set down his backpack. The room was still divided into 2 single beds. The space cozy but redundant, like a painting without a third person. That night they had dinner of pasta and wine. Marianne filled their glasses, then clinked them lightly with Ethan's for the things that were never finished. She said after dinner, they sat in armchairs near the fireplace. Blankets draped across their laps outside. The snow fell steadily, like deep breathing. Marianne told him about the first time David brought her here. He forgot his pajamas, had to wear a coat all night. Ethan laughed, but his heart clenched because the memory was now only half told. He looked at Marianne, her eyes lit up in the firelight. No longer sad, but strange. It was as if she were reliving an old life, and in that life, he was sitting in the exact same place as the person who had once made her heart flutter. Ethan turned away outside. Lake Constance was quiet, as if holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Night fell quickly in the lake. After 8, the cabin was shrouded in darkness, with only the light from the fireplace casting a glow on the ceiling and the shadows of the trees swaying gently outside the window. Ethan sat on the bed, holding a book in his hand, but unable to read a single line. The crackling of the firewood in the stove was like a countdown clock, making the already quiet space even heavier. Marianne emerged from the bathroom, her hair wet, wearing an old fur coat. She coughed softly, then sat down in an armchair by the fireplace, holding a cup of ginger tea. Ethan glanced at her, then looked away in the flickering firelight. Everything seemed to soften, even boundaries. "Aren't you going to bed the snowstorm early?" she asked Ethan, shook his head. "I'll read a little." Marianne nodded, then paused for a long moment before continuing almost in a whisper. "I used to think if there was one thing that would keep your father here longer, it might be this place." Ethan didn't reply. He put down the book and sat up straight, he used to say. It made him feel young again. Marianne smiled faintly, but she couldn't hide her tiredness. And every time he smiled, I forgot I was almost 20 years younger than him. A soft rumble of thunder sounded in the distance, a sign of an approaching snowstorm. And the lights in the house flickered once and then went out. The only light in the room was the flickering firelight and the 2 of them breathing. "Don't worry," Marianne said. "It's just a power outage. It's common here." She took a candle from the drawer and lit it. The pale orange light bathed the room in a half-real, half-dreamy warmth. Ethan stood up and added more wood to the fire. When she returned, Marianne was sitting with her feet up, her robes slightly open, revealing her slender shoulders. She looked at him longer than usual. "How do you feel about this place, Quiet?" Ethan said dryly, and something waiting to explode. Marianne nodded, then put her teacup down on the table. "I feel the same way." No one said anything more. A strong wind blew through the crack in the door. Tilting the candle flame, Ethan stood up and said, "I'll go to bed. There might be a lot of snow tomorrow. We need to get up early." She just nodded when he entered the room and closed the door. He didn't know whether to keep out the wind or to keep himself within a newly created boundaries. That night, snow fell heavily outside, and inside the two of them slept in separate rooms, but their sleep was no longer completely peaceful. Snow fell all the day. Ethan spent most of his time shoveling snow from the front porch and burning wood in the fireplace. Mary Ann did not leave the living room. She sat reading occasionally, looking up at the window, her eyes distant as if searching for someone in the white storm in the evening. They had an early dinner, chicken soup, bread, and hot tea. The air was quiet, gentle, but stifling. Ethan avoided Mary Ann's gaze. She, on the other hand, seemed to look at him longer and longer, with a gentle gaze mixed with something that was no longer stepmotherly, and not quite a stranger either. After dinner, Mary Ann invited Ethan to sit by the fireplace. The snow was so thick that the windows were frosted. The wind beat against the walls of the house, whispering like a distant call. She poured wine, just one glass. Ethan refused. She did not force him. "I thought," she said, after a moment, "that if one day no one needed me anymore, I would come back here, stay alone." Ethan clasped his hands together. "I'm not alone. I have friends. I have a job. No one really has anything, Ethan," she interrupted softly. "I had someone, and now there's just you." Silence fell like the snow outside. Thick, soft, and numbing. Mary Ann turned to look at him. "If you want, you can stay here with me, not out of obligation, but because I believe here. We don't have to play roles." Ethan froze. His heart was beating fast, but his eyes were steady. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I need someone not to replace your father, but to keep me from falling apart." Ethan stood up. He wasn't angry, but he was afraid of her gaze, afraid of what he felt in his heart. Pity, confusion, and a little wavering. "You shouldn't have said that," he whispered. Mary Ann looked at him, unrepentant. "You're not asking me for anything. It's just, if you felt the same way, you'd understand." Ethan shook his head. "I'm not." "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice as soft as a late spring rain. "I never thought if it weren't for you I would have stayed longer. Closer." "No," Ethan said more firmly. "I left because I needed to grow up. I came back because you needed help, not because I needed someone to replace me." The air was thick, the fire was still burning, but they were both cold. Finally, Mary Ann stood up, nodding slightly. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said it. But when people are tired, they tend to forget their boundaries." Ethan nodded, his eyes never leaving the floor. "I understand, but I need to hold on to myself." Mary Ann put her hand on his shoulder very gently. "Thank you for not leaving, and thank you for not staying that night." Ethan did not sleep. He sat by the window, looking out at the snow-covered lake. In his mind was Mary Ann's eyes, and in his heart was a new void, nameless but clear. Not all intimacy leads to love. Not all love has a place to stop. The next morning, the snow had. The next morning stopped. The first rays of the morning sun filtered through the pine needles, illuminating the wooden porch of the lakeside house. The lake was covered with a thin layer of ice that sparkled like broken glass. And everything around was as quiet as a sigh held back from a deep dream. Ethan woke up early. He packed up, folded his clothes, put away the used blanket, and checked his car keys when he stepped out into the living room. Mary Ann was already sitting in the armchair, holding a cup of tea, her eyes looking toward the distant shore of the lake. She turned when she heard footsteps. "Are you leaving so early?" Her voice was not reproachful, just a simple question like any other day. "I think we should end here," Ethan replied. Mary Ann nodded, not objecting. "I understand." Ethan approached, standing for one more night a moment by the door, hesitating. "Do you want me to take you home?" She shook her head slightly. "I'll stay one more night, just one night, to make sure I've really said everything I shouldn't have." He didn't know what to say. There was something about that sounded like a blessing and a farewell. Marianne stood up and took a small wooden box from her pocket before he died. "Your father gave me this," he said. "If you came back, give it to me. I never dared to open it." Ethan took it, looking at the simply carved box, old but sturdy. "Thank you." Marianne smiled. "In any case, I'm grateful you came back and that you knew when to leave." One last time. They didn't hug, just looked at each other one last time, no regrets, no blame. As Ethan left the house, his footsteps left long diagonal tracks in the snow toward the small path leading out of the woods. The wind blew softly at his back. No longer cold, just wind, and behind him, the small house melted into the gray sky like a dream that had hit rock bottom and now was sinking. 2 weeks later, Ethan returned to college in Seattle just as the snow melted in early spring. The city was busier after the holidays, and the campus was bustling with students, the sound of bicycles whizzing across the wet, tiled sidewalks. He walked into his dorm room, 317 on the 3rd floor. Still the same, the desk by the window. The bookshelf slanted to one side and the pale gray blanket he'd folded before leaving. But everything was different, not the room, the person who walked into it. Ethan opened his laptop, checking emails from the architecture department. Class schedules, assignments, announcements for new labs. He found he could read them all without feeling lost. It was as if his mind had been cleared, or rather ready to move. Opening the box on every morning, he walked to class. Through the trees that had yet to sprout leaves, sometimes the image of the cabin by the lake would flash through his mind. Marianne's eyes in the firelight, the gentle, ill-timed request. But he didn't let himself get lost in it, he remembered. But he wasn't stuck one evening. He opened the wooden box Marianne had given him. Inside was a handwritten letter from his father. The familiar clear handwriting. Written in blue ink, he didn't read it right away. He just put it in the desk drawer next to the measuring tape and the unfinished drawing. He knew there would come a better time to open it, but not now. He needed time, and for the first time he allowed himself to take his time. Ethan began writing again. Not blueprints, but short paragraphs about a winter, a cabin, and 2 people learning to let go at the right time. He wrote not to publish, but to preserve something that had quietly changed him. Once the professor asked, "What did you learn after the break?" Ethan replied, "That not all broken things are losses. There are things that need to be broken, so that we can move on." And the professor just smiled, as if understanding there are lessons that only come from very cold seasons and silences that no one teaches us how to name. Ethan opened the letter on a rainy evening. The patter of rain on the dormitory roof reminded him of nights spent in the lake house. The wind, the soft creaking of wood in Marianne's eyes. Silent in the fire, the letter was short, barely more than a page. But each line seemed to have been written in a mature silence. The tone was unpretentious. It was David's voice, deep, steady, and sincere. "Ethan, by the time you read this, I may no longer be around. Don't be angry. If I leave you something that confuses you, I'm not a good person to express my feelings. You probably know that better than anyone. But there's one thing I've always tried to do. Keep you whole before you even knew what whole meant. I know I'm not a perfect father. There are days when I'm too quiet. There are times when I miss the chance to hold you, to ask you a simple question. Are you okay? And then time passes, like the wind erases footprints in the snow. But I am always proud of you. Not because you are good at studying or disciplined, but because you know when to stop, know how to keep going, even when no one tells you which way to go about Marianne. If you read this after staying with her for a while, I just want to say she is a good person, but grief can make people lose their way. If you ever feel like she has crossed the line, please do not be angry. Understand that sometimes people just want to hold on to what is left, even if it is the wrong person at the wrong time. Forgive if you cannot because she deserves it, but because you need to be relieved, son. Do not let the pity for others make you lose yourself. Love with light, not darkness, and if one day you build a house, build it with your own hands, and your heart will no longer carry the old cracks. I will always be somewhere closer than you think. The letter, Dad. Ethan folded the letter and put it in the drawer. Outside, the rain was still falling, but inside, something had stopped. It was not sadness. It was the heaviness of a child who was once uncertain whether he was loved. Now he knew. Spring was slow in the old town. Ethan had come back for a short weekend for a meeting with a lawyer about his father's estate. He hadn't planned to stay long. Just stop by the old house, pick up a few old things, and then head back to Seattle for the day. The house he guessed was different. Marianne's car was gone, the fireplace was gone, and when Ethan opened the door and walked in, the house was so empty that every sound echoed loudly, like an attic that had not been lived in for a long time. In the living room, on a wooden table, was a book of poetry. Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass that Marianne had kept by her bed. A sheet of paper was tucked into the middle page where the poem had been marked, "I bequeath myself to the dirt to grow from the grass. I love if you want me again. Look for me under your boot soles." There was no other note, no address, no goodbye letter, just the poem and the absence. The neighbor said Marianne had left 3 weeks ago, packed alone. Didn't ask for help. The grocery store owner said she'd only bought 1 new suitcase and that she was going somewhere where there's no snow. At least for a while. Ethan stood in his father's study, which had been filled with papers, now empty. On the table was a photo of the 3 of them, David, Marianne, and him on a camping trip years ago. He picked it up, turned it over, and saw Marianne's small handwriting. "Don't keep people behind when all they need is to leave." With peace of mind, Ethan hadn't taken the photo. He'd left it where it was, then locked the door when he stepped out onto the porch. A sudden spring rain was falling, soft, gentle, like the final release of a relationship that no longer needed. Explanation: Marianne was gone, no fuss, no breakup, just plain. Over a year later, Seattle was ablaze with cherry blossoms blooming along the streets near campus. Ethan stood among the trees, sunlight streaming through his dark brown hair, his eyes no longer as lost as before. He was in his final year of architecture, interning at a small studio where he designed simple but light-filled homes. Some should be a place where you can breathe. He had written in his final paper, "Not a place where you keep everything that's dead." He had lost touch with Marianne. He hadn't looked for her. He didn't care where she was. But every time he saw the first snow or heard an old song his father had liked, he would remember, not with tears but with peace. Ethan had begun writing 2 short stories about relationships that couldn't be named, about breakups that no one dared to say. He sent a few to the school's literary magazine. One was published. In it, he wrote, "There are people who pass by us not to stay, but to teach us how to keep ourselves. There are places that used to be homes, then became memories, and there are winters, no matter how cold, when the heart begins to sprout." One afternoon, while sitting in a familiar coffee shop, Ethan opened the drawer of his backpack and took out the old wooden box. His father's letter was still there, unopened, just kept like a silent compass. He smiled, not because everything was good, but because he was still moving forward, and this time with his own footsteps, the following March. Ethan, the following March, returned to Lake Constance alone, unannounced. It was an unplanned trip, like a silent call from the past that he felt it was time to answer. The snow no longer covered the path. Only a few white patches remained on the tree trunks and the old tiled roof. The wooden house was still there, standing silently in the pine forest, covered in the dust of time, but intact like a frozen memory. Ethan stopped the car, stepped out, and stood for a long time in front of the porch, not entering. Just looking. The door still had a small crack next to the handle, a trace from the winter before. When he had opened it, entering a space filled with nameless things, he walked along the shore of the lake where the water had thawed, reflecting the silver sky and the thin, slow-moving clouds. The wind blew gently through his collar, carrying the musty scent of the old forest. In his hand he held an old notebook containing unfinished writings. From the days he stayed at home with Marianne, Ethan sat down on a rock by the water, opened the notebook, reread a few lines, then tore a page, folded it, and dropped it into the lake. The page floated away, spinning slowly, then sank goodbye, not because I forgot, but because I don't need to keep everything on the way back. Ethan didn't. Memories look back, not because he forgot, but because everything needed to be left in its rightful place. Like an old season that had passed, like a person who had stayed, and like Ethan himself that year. And this time his heart was calm enough to call everything by one name. Memories. Ethan walked along the forest path leading away from the lake. The ground was covered with melted snow, revealing moist soil and a few green shoots emerging from the rotting leaves. The sunlight slanted through the leaves, creating shimmering spots of light on his shoulders. He was in no hurry. He carried nothing but a backpack and a notebook that had lost a few pages. But there was something in his steps that was different, no longer forced, no longer avoiding. He thought of his father, who had taught him to be silent, with love of Marianne, who had been lost in loneliness, and of himself, who had wanted to keep everything, but now understood just keep what was right. A gentle wind blew. Ethan stopped, looked up at the sky, and smiled, a smile. Just enough no farewells were heard. There was only a young man walking in the spring, carrying winter in his heart, like a part that had quietly turned into light after listening to the story. What feelings do you carry with you? Do you sympathize with Ethan, with the journey of choosing between love and letting go? Or is there something in Marianne that makes you feel sad? Because we all have been lonely in our own way. See you in the next story, where another heart is waiting to be told, and who knows next time.